Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Marriage and Family Breakout for the Sin Network virtual gatherings. I'm Dean Fulks, and this is my wife, Angie, and we are church planters. We planted Life Point Church in Columbus about 16 years ago, and so we are thrilled just to be with you today to talk through a little bit about marriage. I think it's important for us to say right off the bat, first of all, that we are not experts at marriage. We've made our fair share of mistakes, and well, I've made my fair share of mistakes, and we've learned a lot. So hopefully we can share some of that with you today, especially for church planters during this crisis. You know, part of what I do, I'm the Sin City missionary for Columbus, so I work with planters a lot. Angie and I are blessed to work with planters and planters' wives, and so you know, COVID is just having an effect on our marriages, and just it's making us think crazy. I don't know if you saw this or not recently, but there was a reporter who was interviewed on Good Morning America. His name was Will Reeve, and you know, trying to do things virtually, Will saw a very smaller, you know, version of himself, and he didn't know that the rest of America could see that he didn't have pants on. So COVID's just making us think crazy. And so, you know, I have pants on. Angie has pants on. Yes, while we're doing the breakout today. And so as we talk about marriage, we're just going to spend some time talking about the original marriage in Genesis, and we're going to talk about three observations. First of all, about creation, and two observations. We're going to talk about the curse, and then one observation about the cure. Hey, if you've got questions, there's a feature there on whatever device that you're using to check in with us, so you can ask questions along the way, and we'll do our best to spend plenty of time answering those, as many as we can. Less time of us talking and more time talking about your questions.
Okay. I think if any of us are honest with each other, we would admit that when all of this first started, our perspectives were more, wow, we're going to really redeem this time. This is going to be special and amazing, and like nothing we're going to be so productive. We're going to get a lot done, and then this is going to be over, and we're going to go back to life as normal. And instead, I think we all started, as it progressed, realizing that we were sort of reverting back to maybe old patterns that we thought that we had dealt with before, or dealing with insecurities that maybe we thought we had already resolved in the past, or having even discussions and conflicts and little things that we just hadn't dealt with in a very long time, because all of a sudden all of our schedules were changed, our patterns and our rhythms were different. And so that's why we wanted to talk with y'all today, just to kind of revisit some of the basic things that we know we already know, but that we're having to return to during this time, to make sure that we remember the principles that God's given us, that we've always built on. But I just think we need to go back and revisit given our current situation. So in light of that, I want to read Genesis 1:26 through 28, where it talks about God creating man and woman. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. So I wish I could say that during this time, I just automatically started making good adjustments and automatically went back to what I know about Philippians 4:6-8, about my pre-plan acrostic I learned in Mary Cassian's conversation piece study about how to go through pure, right, excellent, praiseworthy, lovely, admirable, noble, true. If it's not true, don't let it take root in my mind. I wish I could tell you that that's what my immediate response was during this time. But instead, like I said earlier, there was a lot of reverting back to patterns that I thought I had already dealt with in our marriage earlier. So in light of that, Dean's going to bring us the first couple of observations.
Yeah, I think a couple of observations about creation. And the first one is just when you read Genesis 1, men and women were created differently but equally. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that throughout our history, sometimes we have said equally, but when we say equally, we mean that God just loves us equally. And in reality, what that means is that no, in marriage, we're equals. Now, God gives us different roles, right? And at times I'm gonna lead in certain areas, and there are certainly times in our marriage that Angie's gonna lead in certain areas. So men and women, we're created equally, but differently. So there's a difference. There's a difference in role. And so one of the things then that is important because of that is that as you work that out in your marriage, I know for us, so Angie's dad is a pastor, and I don't have a ton of ministry background in my family. So one of my prayers whenever I was called to ministry is that God would bring people to help me. And so in marrying into Angie's family, there was a lot of tenure there and wisdom there, which was super helpful. So her dad did our wedding for us. Now, the problem is that both of us were in seminary when that happened. So we didn't get premarital counseling. Well, we did get premarital counseling, kind of. He gave us a video series, a set of VHS tapes to watch. And we watched the first one and we thought it was goofy. And so we didn't do it. So we didn't have any premarital counseling. And so I blindly walked into marriage with this idea that, well, it's going to be fine because it'll just be like my parents. Like Angie will behave like my mom. I will behave like my dad. I think conversely, she thought the same thing, except about her mom and about her dad. And so I think we'd been married about 18 months, and we sat down and had a conversation and said, we need to talk to somebody. And so we went and sat and talked to somebody. And I think for us, that was really, we kind of did post-marital counseling, right? And we started on a track of learning about ourselves and learning about marriage that was, I know for me especially, and certainly I think for the health of long-term of our marriage, was super helpful. So one thing I would just say to all of us is that every marriage needs a mentor. Everybody needs somebody to go to share the reality of what we're dealing with. And if I could just put a qualifier on it, and this is not biblical necessarily, but I would encourage you to not be family. Like, your mom should not be your go-to for marriage problems. Your dad, your sister, your brother should not be your go-to, in my opinion. What I've seen over the years in counseling people in terms of their marriages is, people, a couple will get in a conflict and one of them will go to their mom, and well, the couple, you'll make up, right? You'll be just fine. Everything will be okay. But your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister, they can't let that go. I mean, they loved you first. But it's important that we see that God created us equally but differently. So then that leads me to the second just observation about creation, is that really Eden was a model for Earth. And this is a reality that just hit me a couple of years ago as I was looking at Genesis 1 that I never thought about. And I'm a little slow to the game sometimes, so you maybe have probably already thought about this. But it was that Eden was a cultivated garden. It was an example. Eden was like a garden in the middle of a forest. And that God was giving Adam and Eve a directive basically to say, you two, see what you're doing here in this garden. And I think the idea, the dream, is that then they were going to move out and they were going to cultivate the earth from Eden. Eden was kind of this model for earth. And so I think there, I just want to say that it is so important, I know for Angie and I, to have the sense that we are, that we joke, we talk about team folks. Like in our marriage, we're on the same team, same dream, right? That we are together in marriage. And one way that I think that's been helpful for us to try and stay there is we had an older couple who mentored us it's probably been 18, 19 years ago now. And they give us this idea called the weekly meeting. And so every week, for us, it's on Sunday nights. We get together and we get our calendars out. And I'm not a good talker. I'm not a great communicator really at the marriage level. You give me that look.
Sure.
And so one thing that is helpful is every week on Sunday nights, we get our calendars out. We talk through our week. And for some reason, because that is on the calendar and it helps us talk the rest of the week. And I don't know, for me, I think Angie like ninja tricks me in that meeting to get me to talk sometimes about things that I don't naturally talk about well. And it keeps us together. So in marriage, you know, man, it's about unity, not uniformity. Your marriage is not going to look like everybody else's
Right.
marriage. Sometimes I'm around other people, or we're around other especially ministry couples, and we hear them say things that they do, and I think we're like, oh man, we should do that, but we're not them, right? So it's really about unity, being a team, not necessarily about uniformity, being like everyone else. Yeah.
The third observation about creation is that the term helper, which is actually in Genesis 2:18, celebrates the nurturing side of God. I'm just going to read that real quickly. It's the verse that says, "Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper corresponding to him." I think sometimes this passage, this word, this concept gets a little bit of a bad rap. Like Dean said, it's not just that God loves us equally, we are equal, but we are different. And so God made us to correspond to our husbands, which indicates that there's going to be differences. We're not going to do everything the same. It's not going to be exactly like he said, uniformity, but we are created to be this helper. And what I love is in studying this just a little bit, the word helper is the Hebrew word azer, and it means to rescue or to save or to be strong, a literal lifesaver. I think that John Eldridge maybe had said that in his previous book, or Wild at Heart, that he wrote. But as I looked at it, it was used 2 times to talk about woman in Genesis 2, and then it was used 3 different times in the Old Testament to talk about nations to whom Israel asked for military aid. But the other 16 times that it's used in the Old Testament were places where it indicated God as Israel's helper. And I love our women's life group this fall did Jen Wilkins' study on Genesis 1 through 11, God of creation. And in it, she pointed out that the fact that it's used also as a word for God helping his people indicates and insinuates that it's necessary, that his help was necessary for their survival. And I wish that more women maybe understood this connotation better, not so we can elevate ourselves, because again, it's not elevating one or the other. It's equal in value, just different in purposes and roles. And so I just love that the connotation there. And of course, one of my favorite passages is Psalm 121, and in verses 1 and 2, both verses use this word for helper when it says, "When I look to the hills, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." So I just think that's neat. And that gets to be us. We get to be, as women, the helpers, the rescuers, the gap fillers, if you will, in our homes. I got really tickled a couple of weeks ago. My younger brother, Chad, and his wife, Jessica, she had posted a picture of the Mother's Day card that he gave her. And I thought it was pretty priceless. So we're going to try to put it up for you to see. But at the top, it says, "Stuff you ask mom." And as you can tell, there's a plethora of things. Can I watch TV? When is my turn? Can I have more? Where is it? Do I have to go to bed? And then stuff you ask dad, "Where's mom?" I got tickled by that because we actually have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old. Our one son is 18, and recently I had gone on a trip, and I remember Dean saying on the phone that my son had come up and Dean had kind of gave him 3 or 4 directives, and without even asking a question about the directives or saying yes sir or anything, he just looked at him and said, "Where's mom? Like, what? Why are you asking me to do this stuff?" So I got really tickled about that. But I think that maybe one of the challenges for us as women is that we can tend to get either to one extreme or the other. We can either think too much of our helper role, or we can think too little of it. And that's kind of where I'll pick up next time, because that's going to be more relevant to what I talk to you about in the next section. So I'll pass it back.
Just want you to know you're very attractive when you break down Hebrew grammar. So the next thing are two observations about the curse. One observation about the curse is that husbands are going to hide and blame. We didn't take time to read all of the text, and you know what happens in the curse. And basically what God says here to Adam is that, listen, work is going to be tough for you. By the sweat of your face, you're going to bring forth bread, and thorns and thistles are going to come up out of the ground. In other words, the ground is no longer going to cooperate with you. And so out of that, that curse, really what it comes out of that moment of hiding. And I think it is the general nature of men when they don't either live up to their own performance, or they have shame, or they have grief, or they feel like someone is not pleased with them, their tendency is to hide. Just like Adam and Eve hid behind the fig trees when God came looking for them. That's not, in my opinion, it's not just a one-time occurrence. That's the pattern for men, is that we are going to hide. And then when we are confronted, our tendency is going to be to blame. And especially in marriage, and when conflict comes up, and most of us are one conflict style or the other. Most of us are fight or we're flight. And we tend to marry someone who's opposite of us. I just think as husbands and as men, and certainly as pastors, we have to be careful in the ways that we our lack of vulnerability is very telling. I would say humility and vulnerability are really, in some ways, your primary currency in your marriage, and that will translate as well to us in ministry. And just specifically, I would say even about this COVID crisis, that Angie and I've talked about this a fair amount, that I think the Lord is teaching me a lot just in my patterns. I'm finding myself waking up at night, being awake for a couple of hours, concerned about reopening our church, or the future, or who's coming back or who's not coming back. Or I found myself dealing with certainly more anxiety than in the past. And it's been great for me. In my devotional time, I've been in Psalms, and I used to be critical of David. I feel like David's like manic. Like he's up here sometimes and he's down here sometimes. I wonder if he's barely a Christian, some of the questions here he asks God. It's been so healthy for my soul, because one of the things that I think God is teaching me in my over-identification with work and pastoral ministry, is that God is just surfacing that maybe that tie, that identifying tie, is too strong. And so in that, I've even just talking about it, being more vulnerable, being more transparent, trying to be more live in humility, even just with Angie and with our team at church and our church body at large, even, I think has been super helpful for me to fight that tendency to want to hide and then to blame.
So then on the flip side, women or wives tend to love and wonder. It took us a while to come up with the right word, but I'll explain why we chose wonder in just a minute. In Genesis 3:16, when it talks about the curse and the elements that pertain to the man and the elements that pertain to the woman, it talks about pain and childbirth. But the implication there is not just in the process of childbirth, but also in the process of child rearing. And so when you think about that, there's that aspect with children, but then there's also that it mentions there as well the desire for her husband, and that he will rule over her. Again, equal, but just different roles, and there will be a longing on our part. And that's where I started thinking about that word wonder, because as women, I think just naturally we love to love. And because of the term that I was talking about before with us being helpers and how God just naturally created us. And I don't mean that every woman wants to be a mom of babies and toddlers and preschoolers. Not everybody loves those seasons and stages, and not everybody's the same in the things that they feel passionate about, or that they feel like they're better at or worse at. I don't mean that, but I just think naturally we love to love. We love to love the people in our lives. If we're a teacher, we love our students. If we're a neighbor, we love that little kid across the street. If we're a wife, we love our husbands. And if we're a mom, we love our kids. And so I think in that, though, we put our hearts out there and we love, but then we're kind of left wondering, is it enough? Is it what it should be? Am I doing it the way that it's supposed to be done? And is it going to be reciprocated? And I think when it comes to Dean, specifically in this COVID crisis, I way back went into insecurity mode because I'm a people pleaser by nature, and I certainly want to please him. I'm not sure how many times in the first 6 weeks of this I asked him, are you mad at me? Are you pleased with me? Am I doing what you want me to do? Is everything okay with us? Which are things that I used to do a lot early on, but it's gotten a little more spread out, and I've been able to manage that a little bit better and speak truth to my own heart, and he speaks truth to me, and I've been able to receive that love better. But when all this started and we all of a sudden were in the same house a lot more hours of the day and a lot more days of the week, I found those insecurities creeping back in of, I don't know if I'm loving him the way that he wants me to love him, and I don't know if I'm doing for my kids that I'm supposed to do. And it felt like I was doing more than ever and still not sure if I was doing enough. So that was one area. And then I think I'm always wondering, am I loving my kids in a way that's going to encourage them to love Jesus? Sometimes you feel like you just do a whole lot of practical things, and is that enough? Or should we be sitting them down and having specific devotions all the time, which I think is great. And I think we should do that and can do that. And at the same time, I think we still aren't sure that that's enough. So that's where I was talking about the wondering. And I just think it's so easy to compare. And you would think somehow that during us being in quarantine and isolation, we would be less prone to compare to other people. But thanks to the blessing of social media and being able to be in contact with someone 24/7, that is not the case. And I don't know if anybody else did this. Women, I wish I could see your faces, but I've just asked myself so many times during this, what am I going to have to show for the COVID quarantine of 2020? I need multiple pieces of furniture to be painted and rooms to be painted and projects to be done. I need revelations in my spiritual life and in my marriage and in my home life. I was seeing all these people saying all these things that God was doing or they was doing or whatever. And I just found myself wondering, what do I have to show for all of this? And I felt really pressured and honestly stressed out and then disappointed. Like, how can I possibly be stressed when we're at home and we're not supposed to do anything? So that's kind of where I was. And I was praying about this and thinking back to a story that God used specifically in my life a couple of years ago when I was really struggling with a season of my life with teenagers where other moms were making different decisions. And I was wondering if I wasn't holy enough or if I wasn't making the right decisions. And I was currently in a study at that time that brought up the story in number 16 of the sons of Korah. And I don't know that I had really studied that story before then. But basically, and this is super, just the bare bones of it, but basically the sons of Korah were Levites, so they were set aside, but they were not the priesthood like Aaron was to be able to go into the Holy of Holies. And so they kind of fussed at Moses and said that they wanted to be able to be a little more higher up than they were as far as their access into the tabernacle. And Moses had to tell them no. And then God told Moses to have those sons of Korah and these other groups of people separate from everyone, because he then proceeded to open up the ground and swallow them into it, which I told Dean, I'm so glad I'm post Jesus and the cross. But anyway, the Lord used that story because I never knew that Psalm 84 is a psalm of the sons of Korah, where in Psalm 84:10 it says, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. And the gal that did the study that I was doing at that time just kind of worded it like this: better is one day doing exactly what God has asked me to do and called me to do than 1,000 days trying to do everything else. And that really just spoke to me, because as my pendulum swings to this, am I doing enough? Do I need to do more? Or am I doing too much and I need to do less? I kind of go back and forth between all those things. Is my identity enough in Dean, or if I put it more in other people, or is it too much in Dean or too much in my kids, to where every rise and fall is the rise and fall in me? And I was just doing that pendulum swing back and forth, back and forth. And whenever I had studied that, it really stuck out to me that, you know what, God is that same shepherd from Psalm 23 who's going to lead me every step of the way, and he's going to show me what he wants me to do. And I remember kind of during that season, one day I came to Dean, and I think I mentioned Lisa Turkhurst maybe, and I said, I just think I just must be a loser because I haven't written a book, and I haven't recorded a podcast, and I haven't written a Bible study. And I just remember he looked at me and said, do you want to do any of those things? And I said, well, no. And he goes, well, then what are you worried about? And I said, well, I'm always just worried I'm missing something that God's asking me to do. But that's where Psalm 23 came in, and God just kept, just kindly and gently reminding me that I'm your shepherd. And if you spend time with me every day, I'm going to lead you. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to direct you. And you're going to know what it is that I'm wanting you to do. And in that, then I can glorify him, which has become a big word for me this year. Glory, for some reason, has just come back to me and back to me and back to me. And abundance. God doesn't just ask us to skirt by with very little. He's always telling us that he's given us more than enough of what we need, whether it's grace or strength or wisdom or love or any of the things that he's given us for life and godliness. And then also just so that we can bring him glory. And I want that in my heart, and I worry that I'm not doing that. But I feel like that Sons of Korah story really reminded me, don't wish for something else. And they weren't wishing for something bad. They wanted to be able to go into the Holy of Holies, but their place was in the courts, and that was their role. And that was what God had asked them to do and designed them to do and prepared them to do. And that was enough.
Yeah, it's good. So the last observation then is just a single observation about the cure. Here, Adam and Eve have sinned. God addresses their sin. But before just sending them out of the garden, he covers them. And the reality is only God can cover our sin. He kills an animal, and in the killing of that animal, he makes a covering for their sin. And that's the Old Testament word there, to atone. We know that word obviously comes up in the New Testament as Jesus is our covering, right? He's our atonement for sin, so that in marriage and in relationship, the reality is God gives us this intimacy that we have with one another really as a tool, a teaching, a reflection of the fact that it's descriptive of the covenant love that he has for us and the intimacy that we're supposed to live in with him. So it draws us back to that gospel reality, primarily that we're all sinful and flawed, and we're going to make mistakes in marriage, but we're not in this 50-50. We're in this 100-100. So just like God has covered us in the person of Christ, we offer one another grace and mercy, and our value doesn't come from our roles, right, or the performance of our roles, but the fact that God would send his son to die for us primarily is what gives us value. So the value then allows us to fail. The value allows us to say, well, you know what, I'm not perfect. That's not an excuse for when you do something wrong, but it certainly allows us to come to one another and offer one another forgiveness and mercy, because that's what God has offered us. There's a lot of you probably read Tim Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage. He and Kathy did such an incredible job with that book, and I refer to it a lot. I use it in premarital counseling, but one of the things that he says in that book is that marriage was given to us not to make us happy, but to make us holy. And as marriage makes us holy, we get happiness thrown in kind of as a bonus, right? So in all of marriage, then we're consistently looking back to God through the person of Christ and his demonstrated love for us, which is what allows us to love each other and love each other well. So that's about 30 minutes of some things that we wanted to talk about from Genesis 1 and 2. And then really we want to spend some time, if you have questions, answering the questions. And Macy Lowry is with us today, and she is fielding any questions that have come up through our first 30 minutes here. And she's gonna pop on and offer us some questions.
Hey guys, we do have a couple of questions. We have one from Meredith Lyons. She asks, how did y'all, so she's from the South, how did y'all practically work through your differences in regards to the ways you were raised and the expectations you both had?
Yeah, so I've got a friend who's probably 40 years older than me, and I was with him one day, and we were talking about this, working through the differences, background, men, women, and he said, "Here's how this worked in my marriage, Dean." He said, "My wife and I agreed when we first got married that I would solve all the big problems, and she would solve all the little problems." And he said, in 40 years, we've never had a big problem. So that was his way of doing it. I think for us, I mentioned that 18-month kind of mark for us whenever we sat down with somebody and started to get some help. And I'll just say from my perspective personally, that was a humbling experience for me, because I had to realize that as much as I love my parents, and I'm certainly, my parents in my mind are up here. I've got great parents, loving parents. So does Angie. They're just incredible people, leaders, godly. That I had to come to grips with the reality that, number one, my parents weren't perfect, their marriage wasn't perfect, and that doing things their way was not perfect. And I struggle hard with this reality that my way is the right way, that my way is the best way. So whenever there would be conflict at times, and I still struggle with this at times, I want to win. When we get in conflict, it's sometimes this is now becomes about that. And I'll definitely miss the forest for the trees, and because I want to win the argument. Like and so I had to take a step back from me and say, you know what, just because it was my parents' way or it's my way, that doesn't make it the right way. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. I'll add on to what he said about the different ways. And listen, y'all, we are different. We are very different. When you talk about early morning and night owl, when you talk about more introverted, more extroverted, talk about hold things close to the chest, tell your whole life story to anybody who asks. I mean, God bless him. He has to sweat constantly. I'm sure this was a real great experience for him. So just let me loose with a mic and a group of people. But anyway, I think that that's something that we've literally we say to each other pretty consistently. Hey, we're doing this different. It doesn't mean that your way's right and my way's wrong. It doesn't mean that my way's right and your way is wrong. And that has helped me. I wish I knew your personality, is it Meredith? But I know with my personality, I tend to automatically think I'm wrong. So it has helped me for us to work through that and just say to each other kind of consistently, just because we're doing it differently doesn't mean that one person is right and one person is wrong. And something else I'll say, and I hope this is relevant. I'm assuming the Holy Spirit brought this to my mind, but I think it's real easy, and I'm going to speak for women with the comparison thing, to look at if we had a wonderful dad, how he did it, or if we had wonderful men that we observed, or marriages in our family or whatever, to see how they did marriage, how they treated women or things like that. And I definitely think that women should be loved. And I'm not talking about, not being kind. But I'm talking about having expectations of maybe certain things being done certain ways at certain times. And I think that one thing that I decided early on with some help as well was that I was going to appreciate who he is and how he works, and that I was going to appreciate the things that he does day in and day out that show me that he loves me and shows me that he cares about me, and not try to expect this or that at certain times or certain dates, even those things are special and important. And let me do say, along the way, he surprised me a number of ways with wonderful gestures, wonderful things, and that's been a pleasant and wonderful surprise at that point. And I've enjoyed those things very much. But I do feel like that was something early on. I would see like friends of mine when we were young whose husbands did certain things in certain ways, and I would think, well, Dean's not like that, or we don't do it that way. And I would start to think that maybe we were less than, or we weren't as whatever, fill in the blank, romantic, spontaneous, whatever thing. But I've tried to learn to really appreciate, because there's a lot to appreciate about him every single day. So that's been another thing that's helped.
And I'll just say too, especially in a pandemic, or especially if God blesses you with children, the priorities should be God, marriage, kids, and family. And we have that tendency to do that. And all of a sudden, everything's about the kids, and you try and squeeze in a little bit of marriage, and your relationship with God kind of suffers, and you feel like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. So I think just keeping those things in the right order, certainly for me, is helpful. When I think, man, I've got to spend time with the Lord. And I'm not like, I hear the Martin Luther quote, I've got to spend the first 4 hours of the day with God. I hear that quote, right? And I also know when you have little children, if you get 4 minutes a day with the Lord, sometimes that's a win, right? So you got to give yourself a little bit of a break in that. But the maintenance of our own personal relationship and intimacy with the Lord, then for me, helps me be in the right spiritual space to do what we need to do with our marriage. And again, it's unity, not uniformity, not like anybody else. So
I'll say one more thing too, if that's okay. Is that okay, Macy?
Yeah, definitely.
One more thing, when Dean talked about us doing the Sunday night meetings, one other thing we learned at the same time was to approach each other kind of cyclically every now and then and just say, hey, what are maybe the top 3 things that make you feel the most loved? And ours are so different that I don't know that I would have known that the things that make him feel most loved would have been those things. One of those is probably easy for me. A couple of them felt really hard for me at first, that I had to really work hard for that. And then it's gotten easier and easier as we've gone. But I don't know that I would have known that. And I feel like that was something that was really insightful for me and really helpful to know, okay, to me, maybe having the house look great when he walks in the door, and me being, showered and have my makeup on, and that maybe to me as a woman, that feels like, okay, I got to prioritize that. But for him, he would rather me be in exercise clothes because I got to work out, which helps me feel better. And I got to spend time with the Lord, and there's some dinner on the table. He doesn't care if were toys on the floor, if there's laundry out on the couch. That was not as important to him, but I wouldn't have known that if we had not had some of those conversations. So I feel like that helped too.
I agree.
That's good. That kind of, what Dean was saying kind of segues a little bit into our next question from Anavit Torres. She asks, do you find that it's easier during this time to have a devotional time together?
Yeah, so that's a great point for us, because we've talked about this a lot. It's that whole marriage unity, not uniformity thing. So we've not done a ton of devotional stuff together, but that's because we were both discipled in seminary, that your relationship with the Lord is personal and intimate, and so we kind of start there. However, I will say, and I'm glad Anavit brought this question up, because I thought about it earlier and didn't say it. One thing that we have started to do is that we will read a marriage book together. And I think more than anything for us, that brings up conversation. I mentioned the Keller book, the Meaning of Marriage book, and we read that book together 12 months ago or so, and just kind of talked our way through it chapter by chapter. And I felt like that really brought a sense of awareness about that was certainly devotional in our marriage, about where one of the great things that Tim says in that book about Kathy. He said, in their, what I believe at that time was 40 some years of marriage, he says that Kathy has been married to 5 men, and they've all been him. And he just talks about how he changes about every 8 to 10 years, and he feels like a different person, and how Kathy just offered him mercy in that. And I would have never recognized that in myself, but as I thought about it, man, that was reality, and God's sanctifying work in me. And I thought, man, that's very true of Angie. She's been very merciful to me over the seasons of our lives as I've changed and become really a different person than the person that she married. Hopefully in some good ways, but not the same. Yeah.
Well, she's still around, so hopefully in some good ways.
That's right. Very good. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we can change directions just a little bit in our questions. This one's from Brandon Boatner. He is curious about some parenting pointers during this pandemic.
Is there a way to ask him what ages of kids? I don't know if he can respond back or not, if he's
I'm not
still
sure.
watching.
Yeah,
We'll see. We can start and then see what he says.
that sounds good.
Yeah, I'll tell you some of the things that I've appreciated about folks at our church during this season is that a lot of folks are they're understanding to offer their kids mercy, that this is a season, this is not a lifetime of parenting. So the choices that you make now are very narrow. So for example, one of the young dads came and asked me, he said, listen, I don't know what to do. My kids are watching screens way more, but he said, but as they're watching screens, they're interacting with friends, which they don't get to do because they're not at school and because they're not in extracurriculars. He's like, that's their only point of connectivity. And he said, my wife and I, he's like, we've just kind of landed that we're just going to allow for more screen time, because that's also screen time is also friend time. And I thought, man, there's a lot of wisdom in that, in being willing to bend on some things that you're normally, and this is how much screen time you're going to get per day. And, all of a sudden now screen time is friend time. And, he's done, I thought, just a great job talking with his wife, talking that through, and they've communicated well about it. And we're on the same page about it. So one thing I would just say is just to recognize that as we are going through this as parents, our kids are going through this.
Yep.
And it's huge change
Yeah.
for them as well. And so, man, we've just got to offer one another mercy.
That's exactly what I was just sitting here thinking, is just grace upon grace, because, I'm an adult. I almost said how old I am. I guess I could, but I'm an adult, and I don't know that
She's
I've
28.
always, yes,
She's
thank
28.
you. I don't know that I've through this known at different times why I felt different ways, or even how I felt sometimes. So how much more children or teenagers, like we have a son who's a senior in high school, and so he's not doing all the stuff that seniors are doing. And how do you even kind of process that at the ages that they are? So I was thinking the exact same thing, that I think there's just a lot of grace to be given. I don't know that this is a time where our expectations really need to be ratcheted through the ceiling. And I don't mean, let it all go, but I think there's just a lot of grace that needs to be given, because we've never done this before. It's very unusual, and there's a lot of implications that I think we don't even realize yet, that we're all just sort of treading through kind of softly and slowly together.
And I don't think that means it's the wild, wild west.
Right.
I would say to Brandon, I'm not saying you were saying that, but
No, yeah.
I would say to Brandon, if there are rhythms that you can find, and certainly one would be, depending upon the ages of your kids, you and
she's got them.
Oh,
yeah. So all boys, 6, 10, 11, and 12.
Okay.
Oh, forget about it, man. You got no shot. No, I would just say, man, if there's a way to get them in rhythm of maybe going to bed at a fairly consistent time, that you've got to have some time, Brandon, with just you and your wife.
Yeah.
If you can. And even if that's, man, we're going to work at this every other night, or we're going to, I think that's important. Angie was reading a Paul David Tripp book recently that talked about parenting. And one of the things that he focused on was just the necessity of time together in relationship. And so going back to those 3 things that we sometimes get flipped, when we put the kids first and then it cuts into marriage, man, that's tough. And so we've got to make that as much as you can, but it's a difficult season. Truth is.
And I think with a 6 to a 12-year-old and all being boys, you've got a ton of energy and you need some outlets. And right now, I don't know where you are, but it's raining cats and dogs constantly. So that's really hard when you have younger kids that just need to get their energy out somehow. But I also think it's good to remember that each of your kids are at different ages and different stages and seasons. And so it's okay to maybe let that 12-year-old have some privileges that the 6-year-old doesn't get. I think that makes them feel kind of special, and like you're giving them some just some ownership and some responsibility or some privilege because they're just a little bit older. And I think that preteen time, especially, they're just coming into their own on so many things and figuring out so many things. And so I think even giving them a little something extra during this time, like maybe there's a night, a week, or a month or something where the younger two have to go to bed, but the older two get to stay up and watch a movie with y'all or do something special with y'all that the other ones maybe don't always get to do. I think that would be a good thing too during this time, because I think naturally when life is normal, those things kind of happen. You know, everybody's getting up for school, but there's different responsibilities. And so different ones can go to bed at different times, you know, but when there's not, you can tend to want to go across the board with everybody. And I think it might be nice to sort of change those responsibilities or expectations or privileges based on their ages too. I don't know if that helps, but.
Well, it helped me. I have
Oh.
one 5-year-old and I'm feeling guilty about screen time.
And I just think, I remember my mom telling me at one point, because I was super worried that I wasn't getting on the floor and playing with my daughter enough. And she was like, man, sometimes you survive. And I don't mean we don't aim to thrive. I don't mean, like Dean said, the wild, wild west and chaos and just let it all fly and don't worry about it. But I also think there's times to say, okay, this is difficult right now. So we're going to do what we need to do to get through this the best way we possibly can. And maybe that doesn't look like what we would have dreamed up during this, you know, spring or summer, but because of the circumstances we've been given, we can work within that and have our expectations be maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, no, that's really good and super encouraging. We have another one that is definitely in a different direction. And this is from Adrian. And Adrian asks, how can we keep the intimacy and romance alive during this time? I have a teen.
Man, this is Andy's question all the way.
Oh, Adrian has a teen and a 9-year-old, and it's hard to have the alone time as a couple.
Yeah, that is true. Are you
Yeah,
going to start?
I would just go back to what I just said a second ago. I mean, some consistency around their bedtime, trying to create some time and space for you and your spouse during this time is critical. I think we have seen that normal rhythms and patterns when our kids have consistent schedules, that allows us to have some more consistent schedules, and especially in the areas of intimacy and those kinds of things. So we've definitely had to be creative time wise, and when they're going to be, all of our kids are teenagers and older, which means they're even more night owls, right? So that can become a challenge. But it just, I mean, truth is, you're just going to have to be creative and find time that maybe normally you don't have.
I remember us having conversations along the way in our marriage, and we would talk about the fact that I just needed to think about it. And I would be like, what? Think about what? You know, but what I've realized is my brain is going 90 to nothing all the time about everything. And not everybody's personality is like mine. Some people are a little more disciplined and ordered, but I kind of let things push me from thing to thing to the next, and everything feels like a domino. And I feel like when I go into one room, I find 3 more things. Then I forgot why I even went in that room. Then I go back to the other one and there's more waiting for me. And so I just feel like I bounce like that all day long sometimes. So for me, it's a matter of just stopping and being intentional and thinking about it. And chances are, if I give time to think about it, then I'm able to follow through better in some way or another, or even praying about it and just saying, Lord, could you let those kids go to sleep tonight so that, or have a long nap today, or whatever the case may be, so that we can have an extra, you know, span of time to just be together. And I have found him faithful, because when I'm thinking about it and I'm praying about it and I'm being more intentional about it, I just seem to be more apt to do what at least I can do in the midst of the things that I can't control, to try to help that. And I think as our kids have gotten older, I don't make a huge deal of it, but some nights I stay up because I'm a night owl. But I've gotten to where I'll just make sure I touch base with all the kids and say, hey, not sure what you're up to, but just letting you know I'm going to bed with Dad tonight. So love you. See you in the morning. And I feel like that at least gives them an indicator, hey, I'm going to bed. And it doesn't always work, but it helps, you know.
I think all of our you know, because our kids are older teenagers, whenever she does that, I think they get a little bit sick at their stomach. But I think they get the picture.
That makes me a little sick in my stomach. But anyway, okay.
Good, good.
I was going to go back and say one more thing to Brandon. I don't know if he's still on here,
Mhm.
but I was thinking about, as adults, often what we have said in our home and in our church is to do things that I can never think of the word when I'm trying to think of it, but that stir up our affections. That's the word, to stir up our affections for God. And so maybe that's something that, with your boys being at different ages and being boys, what are things that for them stir up their affections for God? For them, it could be, I don't know, the younger ones, Adventures in Odyssey or something like that they like to listen to, or maybe there's some kind of I know Priscilla Shire has novels for young boys, and, you know, just things that would be things that they like that would stir their affections. But again, not to have the expectations too high and to let them be kids while they can. But that was just something else that came to me, that, you know, even there's podcasts and things I think now that kids and teenagers can listen to that at least will get them thinking about spiritual things, even if they don't even think it's a spiritual discipline. So that was just one more added little thing I thought of.
That's good.
And I would just say too, and you know, so we have 2 girls and a boy. The boy sandwiched in the middle. He's 18. Angie mentioned he's a senior. So I've asked him a couple times. I've been like, man, what have been some of your favorite things that we've done, or some of your most memorable moments? And consistently, he comes back to when he turned 13, and it was just me and him. We went to Cincinnati. We went to a Reds game. I took him to the Montgomery Inn for the first time and got him a full rack of ribs. And so
had letters written from the men in our family to him.
Yeah, and so at points along the way, he would open up another letter. And so, you know, for an 18-year-old kid, what is he gonna keep? If you go look at the things he's kept, he's got every one of those letters, you know, from other men that he looked up to, from family members who were older than him, who, you know, were men who kind of zeroed in on something specific. So, you know, maybe with your boys, looking for those opportunities at key moments along the way to have other men speak into their lives. Involve grilled meat is always great for young boys who are about that age, and I think time will be helpful.
I'll also go back to the question before about romance. There's a book,
I like it when you go back.
Yeah. There's a book called Sheet Music by Kevin Lehman. And listen, I'm going to tell you up front, he is a hokey man. I don't know him personally. He's hilarious and he is super knowledgeable. But I'm just giving you the you know, you just need to know there's some hokiness about it. But it is a really, really good book, especially I think for women. I'm just letting them know
It's good.
I don't want you to be like, this Angie Folks recommended me this book and it's super hokey. But it's really, really good. And he brings up some really good points, and he explains some things that I think are really, really relevant, and that we as women don't always think about for men. Like, we might think, and I'm not meaning this in a demeaning way, but we might just think, oh, saying that would be silly, but that really means something significant to our husbands. And so I think he does a good job in that book. It's just, he says some things that are kind of funny, but I think that's a good recommendation too, if you're wanting. I don't think that's necessarily going to help you in the schedule of COVID. Sorry about that. That may just prayer and God's kindness. But anyway, just one little thing I thought of too.
That's good. That's good. Okay, one final question.
Okay.
And this is from Jason Williams. Sorry. What are some prayers you pray for your spouse during this time?
Yeah, I think that I have been praying specifically for Angie, just out of our conversations. You know, she mentioned earlier your tendency, right, in a crisis. Some people kind of feel like, well, a crisis creates this and this and this. I think that a lot of times crises reveal what's already there that could use some work. And so I would just say, in some of the things that we've talked to about each other during the season, like she talked about, you know, hey, our tendency is going to be to default to old patterns or whatever. So my prayers for Ange have really revolved around her saying, I want to really grow through some of these patterns that, and maybe I thought were gone, but just because of the crisis have kind of reared their head and are still there. And then I would say prayers for myself during this time to help, just to ask the Lord, His Spirit, to make me more aware of how I can minister to her and to her needs. And 100, 200, 300 years ago, agrarian culture, husbands and wives were together a lot more. They were raising crops together. They were doing everything. And then Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden, man leaves the house, right? And he's gone 8 to 10 hours a day. And now in our reality, that could be the man or the woman leaving the house working. So spouses kind of pass like this. But all of a sudden in this COVID reality, hey, we're back together again, right? And maybe we're not ready. We're not ready for that. So I pray, those things for her, and then just pray that God would make me aware, raise my level of awareness.
Yeah, I think specific things, a lot of my prayers for him during this season have revolved around things with church, just because I know it's been heavy. It's just felt like such a big responsibility to make, sorry to use the word unprecedented because it's used a lot right now, but unprecedented decisions for our church body, knowing that the, opinions vary so widely from one end of the range to the other. So praying for him about that. And then also just that in that there would be unity with him and our staff in particular. And then just for him to have rest, because he mentioned waking up at night and things like that. But I was going to say, in addition to the general things, I have a little calendar that I prayed through for my husbands and kids. It was given to me a long, long time ago. And if it's still there, it's at inspiredtoaction.com, inspiredtoaction.com. And it's praying daily for your children and praying daily for your husband. And I've just gotten to where I use this as a guide every single day. Every single day, it has a character trait from either Christ or scripture, and one scripture to pray. And so I have found that instead of reinventing the wheel, this has been a good tool for me to have. And then it prompts me to then pray for specific things that fall under that category each day. So that has helped me because I need help. There we go. Yeah.
And that's a good spot to say, come back to just the final conclusion that we had there is that only God can cover our sins, that we all need help.
That's right.
That we've got to offer one another grace and mercy, especially during this season. So, man, we would say thanks to everybody for joining us today. And I think, Macy, you said that was the last question, right?
Yep,
so,
last question today.
For you, know that we're praying for you during this season.